B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins, News and Comment. It's Monday, February 26, 2018. Your humble host has picked up reliable forecasts of snow in the Sierra Nevada mountains. I'm going to take a couple of days off this week and go find out if it's worth skiing on. I'm a little amped up after watching the Olympic athletes and some of their cool tricks, but I'll try not to do anything that busts me in the head. My current plan is to post an interview podcast on Thursday and resume my daily news and comment podcast on Friday this week. So we've got a fresh Supreme Court denial, and it's a brief statement from the court, but it declined an emergency appeal from the Trump administration related to DACA, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program. That was the executive order issued by Barack Obama to protect a group of so-called dreamers here in the United States. And after a federal district court here in San Francisco had issued a nationwide injunction on most aspects of Trump's order to cancel Obama's order effective March 5th, and so the Supreme Court issued a brief statement saying that they will not take up the case on an emergency appeal. They will allow it to work its way up through an appeals court first. Now, the practical impact of this is that politicians will probably stop talking about dreamers until there is a definitive ruling from the Supreme Court, and they may punt it all the way past the November election. Because, at least as a practical matter, the need for an appeals court ruling and then to get in line for the U.S. Supreme Court is going to take months. And so, since there has been no action from the Congress on this matter, it will revert to the courts. And now the dreamers, I guess we can say they're no longer directly hostages. Those who have coverage are permitted to apply for renewal of it. No new people can apply to get the protection of DACA. But this will, at least I think, take the pressure off. And in many ways, that's unfortunate because it will allow this to just dangle for a longer period of time. And it harms these group of individuals. They can't plan their futures, whether they're going to go to college or take a job in another state. If they leave the country, they are subject to deportation. And so this is a serious problem for this group of people. And the case that the Supreme Court said, bring it back to us later, was brought by 5 sets of plaintiffs, the states of California, Maine, Maryland, and Minnesota, and also by the University of California in the form of its president, one Janet Napolitano. Now, when you go back to 2012, she was the Secretary of Homeland Security in the Obama administration, and she signed the document that established the program. So she has more than a passing interest in the DACA issues. So now they're in limbo. Nothing will change immediately. The ruling would permit single deportations in cases where the government makes a strong case. But in general, the dreamers are safe. It's simply that their futures are hanging in the balance. And we learned that over the last few days, there was a 50-minute phone call from Washington to Mexico City. And Trump had a difficult conversation with Mexican President Enrique Peña Nieto. Peña Nieto had been planning to come to visit Trump at the White House, but after this conversation, the trip is on hold. And apparently Trump lost his temper, according to one Mexican official. The White House downgraded it to turbulence or exasperation. However, we can imagine how the conversation went. No, Mexico will not pay for your frickin' wall. And speaking of immigrants, I've released a new podcast interview today at whowhatwhy.org, part of my continuing series over there. And I held a conversation with Carlos Hidalgo, a man who lives here in California. He's 50 years old, and he has spent 2 tours or terms at the Adelanto immigration prison in the desert of Southern California. And the stories he tells are chilling, of maggots in the food, of fights that break out and guards who are not equipped or numerous enough to deal with it, trading sex for favors in prison, and all kinds of other hijinks, including limited access to legal counsel. It's quite a story, and I hope that you'll take a listen and learn what life is like in an ICE prison. Here's an excerpt from my conversation with Carlos Hidalgo.
In one occasion, they gave us ground turkey meat. The minute the trays arrived to the dorm and we lined up, we started feeling the smell. And when I saw that first tray, because I used to run the dorms and serve the food after the cart, I noticed the meat itself, Peter, was moving. There were maggots in the food, in the meat. And this is like something so obvious. The sergeant tells me, there's nothing there. Serve it, you eat it. I said, no, you eat it, take one spoonful of this, and then I'll eat the rest, only if you take the first bite. And he couldn't even get close to the tray. I mean, that's how careless they are. I mean, how can you be so heartless? You're going to give us food with maggots in it, you know? So when all these atrocities are being committed, we had decided to take a stand. 840-some detainees at the time decided to do this. Okay, so once they found out that I was the one that orchestrated this, they came after me with the intentions that they were going to take me to the doctor, but I knew that was not the case because I had made no medical call. So they took me out from my dorm and they put me in solitary confinement. My attorney, my civil rights attorney, Christina Fiala from Civic, they kept calling. My daughter was calling, and they could not locate me. My number was off, and they don't know if I had been transferred, what had happened to me. And in the end, they ended up transferring me to Theo Lacy in Orange County. And my transfer documents read, to be transferred to Theo Lacy, consider a danger to the safety and the security of this facility.
I invite you to listen to the full interview with Carlos Hidalgo. You can find it at whowhatwhy.org. More court action today as oral arguments were heard at the U.S. Supreme Court in a case that is likely to cripple public employee unions and, in particular, their involvement in the political process. Now, this is a case that's been lingering, and the court had deadlocked following the death of Antonin Scalia. And so the case is back before them, and they have a full complement of justices, including Justice Neil Gorsuch, who is historically anti-labor. And what's curious is in the oral arguments, Gorsuch was kind of like Clarence Thomas. He was silent, he asked no questions, and I fear that means that he didn't have any questions because his mind is already made up. And today at the New York Times, there's a good background story on the origins of this case, Janus, I think it's Janus versus Illinois. And we learn that a rich industrialist named Richard Uihlein, who lives in Illinois and has spent millions backing Republican candidates like Scott Walker, the union buster in Wisconsin, Senator Ted Cruz of Texas, and Governor Bruce Rauner, the millionaire Republican who is currently the governor of Illinois. And Uihlein pumps money into the Liberty Justice Center, the Illinois Policy Institute, the Federalist Society, and many other organizations that promote busting of unions. And I fear that this is going to be a critical case. It's based on the role of the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees, AFSCME, and whether they can require members to pay dues for the bargaining representation. And it basically is a way to cut the funding stream of unions and to cut off the political money that they have been putting most typically behind Democratic candidates. And over at, Columbia University, political scientist Alexander Hertel Fernandez says that the conservative effort is part of a multi-pronged, multi-layered strategy. And he said the extent of coordination on the right often dwarfs liberal efforts. On the state level, says Hertel Fernandez. Conservative groups are doing different things, mobilizing different constituencies, but they're all working with one another. You don't see that same thing on the left. So this is not some kind of just a case that happened to come before the Supreme Court. This is a long-running conspiracy, yes, by wealthy, industrialist, corporate types to eviscerate unions. So we'll be watching it carefully. More action in the courts. A federal appeals court today ruled that a 1964 civil rights law bans anti-gay workplace discrimination. At issue is whether Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of '64, which bans discrimination on the basis of sex, also bans workplace discrimination due to sexual orientation. Here's a clear statement from the Second Court of Appeals, and it was an en banc ruling. All 13 judges in New York ruled on this matter. Here's the judgment of the majority. We now hold that sexual orientation discrimination constitutes a form of discrimination because of sex. And they use the example, a woman who is subject to an adverse employment action because she is attracted to women would have been treated differently if she had been a man who was attracted to women. We can therefore conclude that sexual orientation is a function of sex, and by extension, sexual orientation discrimination is a subset of sex discrimination. Now, of course, pandering to his right-wing homophobic lovers, Trump will, of course, appeal this all the way to the Supreme Court. And on this one, I predict they will let the appeals court ruling stand. Even more court action. I got an alert from Public Citizen. They are plaintiffs in a case against Trump, challenging his arbitrary plan that for every new regulation adopted, 2 have to be discarded. And the president of Public Citizen, Robert Weissman, said Trump's deregulatory executive order aims to empower big business to pollute, cheat, rip off, endanger, discriminate, and price gouge free from government restrictions. Unfortunately, the court concluded that Public Citizen and colleague groups do not have standing to challenge the order at this time. But our members are being hurt right now by Trump's order, and the order is impeding our ability to advocate. So apparently this is a temporary ruling. Basically, the plaintiffs have to come back and prove that they have been harmed. And I don't think that's going to be too difficult. Now, one of the reasons that Trump's attacks on regulation have so much resonance and gain traction with a pretty wide swath of the American public is that we all know about government regulations that don't make sense. And in Sunday's San Francisco Chronicle, a lengthy story describes how after the wine country fires, which burned 6,000 homes to the ground and left many people without a place to live, a group of folks who gather every summer up there on the big desert in Nevada for Burning Man, they decided that they would use shipping containers that they take to Burning Man every year and use as their lean-to, their shelter, that they would bring them over to Sonoma County and park them and furnish them with beds and sheets and living equipment, and allow those who had been displaced by these fires to use them as temporary housing. And after 5 months of fighting City Hall, and that's what it was, in Santa Rosa, California, the burners gave up and took their shipping containers back. And I'll spare you all the details, but fundamentally, the city of Santa Rosa said that it couldn't sign off on people living in these shipping containers because they had been built to the building code of the state of Nevada and not the building code of the state of California. Now, that's just bullshit. That is red tape. That's cover-your-ass mentality. And sure, if they had issues about that, they could get the people who want to sleep in those containers to sign a waiver of liability. But instead, they stood on the red tape, and nothing happened. Over in Broward County, Florida, the sheriff, Scott Israel, is in a lose-lose situation. He is trying to push back on reports that there were more than 23 incidents of contact between Nicholas Cruz and or his family and the Broward County Sheriff's Office over the years. Israel's office issued a statement saying since 2008, they had responded to 23 incidents where previous contact was made with the killer or his family. But they said, stop reporting the number 39. It's simply not true. And then BuzzFeed dug into it, and they've discovered as many as 45 contacts between that family and the sheriff's office since 2008. Sheriff Israel is also denying reports that there were 3 other deputies armed and at the ready who were at the school in Parkland as the shooting was underway. Now, whether it's 1 deputy or 4, whether it was 22 calls, 23 calls, or 45 calls, this agency is clearly in trouble. And almost all sheriffs are directly elected by the public, and they don't really report to a higher authority. And in some jurisdictions, this creates some very serious problems of corruption and, shall we say, unequal application of the law. And the problems of Scott Israel and his Broward County Sheriff's Department are a convenient way for the NRA to shift its blame game away from weapons and weapon regulation and to the Sheriff's Department. But I do think that the students are going to have an impact. They've survived death threats and a lot of pushback from right-wingers and gun nuts. And I think we have seen a tipping point, and I'm eager to see where it all leads. Over the weekend, the Democratic rebuttal memo to the Devin Nunes Intelligence Committee memo was released, and it suffered from many redactions, some of which do limit our ability to completely understand it. But the primary point of the Democratic memo was that FBI and Justice Department officials, they claim, did not abuse the foreign intelligence surveillance process. They claim they didn't omit material information or subvert, quote, this vital tool to spy on the Trump campaign. And from my reading of the document, which runs, 10 pages with footnotes, the major claim is that they have supplied a new date about when certain events took place. And this does appear to preclude the idea that the Christopher Steele dossier was used as a primary basis to request the warrant to surveil Carter Page. So by supplying that one date, the Democrats have filled in the timeline a little further. We still need to see the entire warrant application document because it will tell us what has been asserted by Nunes and contradicted by the memo from Adam Schiff and his team. Now, the other big takeaway for me is that the Democrats are embracing the FBI as a faultless agency, the Department of Justice, at least as it was when Obama left it, as a pure as the driven snow legal defender of the Constitution. And these are untenable positions. And by arguing, as they do in the memo, that the FISA Accord is above reproach, that no agency has ever lied to it, and that, in fact, the Republicans have had no interest in questioning the validity of the FISA Accord in the past, the Democrats are ignoring a fundamental problem that will exist even after the Trump-Russia episode is finally over. And that is that agencies have lied repeatedly to the FISA Court, and the court's own rulings disclose this. And when I shared with you the April 2017 FISA Court judgment that was leaked in recent weeks, a lot of it related to efforts to catch up on past failings. And as I've mentioned, the NSA is accused of lying to the FISA Court more than any other agency, but the CIA and FBI are not free of that taint. And so as this whole issue continues, with the plea deal from Rick Gates last Friday, I see this whole freight train moving forward, and that Manafort will be convicted of attempting to scheme, to use his position on the Trump campaign to refinance his messy personal empire. And they certainly deceived Trump in their efforts to do that. What remains to be seen if there is a nexus between the Manafort case and the claims that Russia hacked the DNC, gave that info to WikiLeaks, and that turned the tide of the election in favor of Trump. And Adam Schiff is quoted at one of the Sunday morning talk shows saying, "I've been on the Intelligence Committee for 10 years now, and this is the first time Republicans have taken issue with any FISA application. I don't think that's a coincidence that it serves the president's interest to do so here. The FBI have acted appropriately." Now, to make a statement like that, you have to overlook hundreds of cases of these frame-ups of so-called domestic terrorism defendants or criminals. You have to overlook the massive abuse of FBI, national security letters, wiretaps, and other invasive processes. And this is where the long-term damage of Russiagate, I think, will really occur. I was intrigued by a weekend op-ed column by a syndicated conservative columnist who I believe identifies as a Republican. His name is Ruben Navarrete Jr., and maybe he shows up in your newspaper. He's syndicated by the Washington Post. And he wrote, "Candidates, not Russians, divided America during the 2016 election." He writes, "Republicans wanted to deflect attention away from Mueller's investigation into possible collusion between the Russians and the Trump campaign and avoid questions about why, in Trumpland, so many roads lead to Moscow. Democrats want to continue to hammer away at their claim that the Russians cost them the election by, for instance, using social media ads to convince voters not to support their party's nominee. After all, this is cheaper and easier than leaving Washington and traveling to the Rust Belt with an economic plan that lures back working-class voters. Even so," he says, "I don't buy the idea that the Russians divided America, and neither should you. The evidence is depressingly clear that it was Americans who divided America." And he talks about the two most seriously flawed presidential candidates served up by the major parties ever, the bloody effort to blunt the ascent of Bernie Sanders in the Democratic primary. And he closes by saying, "What a mess these two made of the American political landscape. Hopelessly in love with themselves, but without the slightest bit of shame, they left the country in shambles. But do tell me again how it was the Russians who divided America. I just love a good fairy tale," he says. Every day I pause for a moment to thank the people who support my work here at the Peter B. Collins Podcast with your subscriptions. People like Linda Gray, Benny Alto, Patrick Garay, and George Reeves. I'd like you to join them for $5 a month, or even a little more if you care to. You can get your own subscription, gives you first crack at our in-depth interviews. Visit peterbcollins.com. Click on the menu button, pull it down, click on Become a Subscriber, and it'll take you right over to the sign-up page where you can take care of business. And today, for my subscribers, I'm releasing a new in-depth interview with Adam Eichen, Rabbi Michael Pollack, and activist Rachel Murphy. They're all part of the March on Harrisburg, and they're fighting to return democracy to the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. Here's an excerpt from that conversation with Rabbi Pollack, who talks about the fact that there are no restrictions on campaign contributions or gift to legislators under Pennsylvania law.
I was in a meeting a few months ago with a freshman representative, and he kind of really laid out what it means to walk into Harrisburg. And when you walk into Harrisburg, there are two paths in front of you. You can choose to side with corruption, or you can choose to have your integrity. And this representative was saying that every Saturday he sees an executive of Comcast, and he knows that he can ask that Comcast executive for $100,000, and that he'll give it to him. And they'll both know what that means. And what that means for the representative is an open-door policy to Comcast for the rest of his career. And it also means, though, that what he can do is take that money, dole out $500 here, $1,000 there to all of his colleagues' campaigns, buy himself enough favor, And after a few cycles, he could become the Speaker of the House and then a U.S. Senator, and who knows. And he said, that's how Pennsylvania works. You show up on day one, there's two roads in front of you. Which one are you going to walk down?
That's Rabbi Michael Pollack. You can get more information on the March on Harrisburg at marchonharrisburg.org. And a little grassroots activism in the Democratic Party here in California. They held their state convention and denied an endorsement to incumbent Senator Dianne Feinstein, running for her fifth term. She only got 37% of the vote from the delegates. Pat Harris, the upstart progressive who's appeared on our podcast, he got 5% of the delegate vote. And Kevin De Leon, who is the current Democratic Senate leader in the state Senate in Sacramento, he narrowly missed the 60% cutoff point to win the endorsement of the party. He got 54%. And what is funny, I think, is that Dianne Feinstein was given an allotted period of time to give a speech. She was giving her speech when they started to play music to get her off the stage. And when the music didn't stop, Dianne Feinstein said, well, and this is a soundbite that will haunt her, I guess my time is up. It's not time up for Chinese President Xi Jinping. His allies are moving to scrap term limits in the country and make him the next Mao Zedong. He may end up serving for life. Should American casino mogul and over-the-top Zionist Sheldon Adelson be permitted to contribute to the cost of building a new U.S. embassy in Jerusalem? I say no. This would be tainted money. Now, there is a history of wealthy people paying to refurbish embassies around the world for the United States. But the idea that we need private money in this provocative move of shifting our embassy into Jerusalem, which is going to anger not only Palestinians, but people of other religions as well. And I think that they should say, no thanks, Shelley. We don't need it. The Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity have issued a new open letter to the president where they warn of the growing risk of U.S. conflict of a military nature with Iran. And they argue that with Benjamin Netanyahu coming to Washington to visit Trump next week, that the U.S. may be sucked into Israel's desire that we launch a war with Iran. And the intelligence professionals say that, we believe the recent reporting regarding possible conflict with North Korea has somewhat obscured consideration of the significantly higher probability that Israel or even Saudi Arabia will take steps that lead to a war with Iran that will inevitably draw the United States in. I'm linking to the VIPS memo in the show file for today's podcast. Take a look when you have a chance. And in Europe, there are diplomats who are trying to scramble to respond to Trump's demands to fix the six-nation deal with Iran. That's Obama's nuclear agreement with Iran. And as you know, I never believed that Iran was trying to build a nuclear weapon. That, I believe, was a myth used by the Bush administration to promote regime change in Tehran. The New York Times obtained a copy of some of the diplomatic documents showing that the U.S. is demanding a commitment to renegotiate limits on missile testing by Iran, an assurance that inspectors have unlimited access to Iranian military bases, and an extension of the deal's expiration dates. This is a renegotiation, and Iran has no incentive to participate. But Trump believes that he can build up enough pressure and force it down their throats. I think it's highly risky, extremely dangerous, and has no relation to the interests of the United States that I can see. Thanks for listening to my daily news and comment podcast. It's available on YouTube. And if you go to YouTube, click that subscribe button for me, will you please? I'm Peter B.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails to you. Keep smiling